A man arrived at a farm in Indiana carrying everything he owned. He had answered a personal advertisement placed by a widow looking for companionship, marriage, and a new future. Before leaving home, he told friends where he was going. Then, he disappeared. He wasn't the only one. Over the years, several men traveled to the same farm. Many arrived with cash. Many were never seen again. And when a fire finally destroyed the property in 1908, investigators uncovered a mystery that would become one of the most disturbing cases in American criminal history. Because the question was not only how many people died there, it was whether the woman at the center of the story had died at all. Why did they vanish? At the beginning of the 20th century, America was changing. In rural communities, personal advertisements became a common way to meet a future husband or wife. One would eventually become linked to a story that still raises questions more than a century later. Brynhild Paulsdatter Sturseth was born on November 11, 1859, in rural Norway. She grew up in a farming family during a time when life was often difficult and opportunities were limited. Like many young Norwegians of her generation, she lived in a world shaped by hard physical labor, long winters, and the constant challenge of earning a living from the land. Much of what is known about her early years comes from records and later accounts, some of which remain difficult to verify. As a result, historians continue to debate where documented fact ends and legend begins. One of the most frequently repeated stories involves an incident that allegedly occurred when Belle was still living in Norway. According to later reports, she attended a local dance while pregnant. During the event, a man reportedly assaulted her, striking her in the abdomen. The attack was said to have caused complications that led to the loss of her unborn child. Some versions of the story claim the man later emigrated to America and died not long afterward. But there is very little evidence confirming these details, and many historians consider the account impossible to verify. Whether the story is true or not, it eventually became part of the mythology surrounding Belle Gunness. As the years passed, Norway offered few opportunities for ambitious young people seeking a different life. Like hundreds of thousands of other Scandinavians during the 19th century, Brynhild decided to leave her homeland behind. In 1881, she emigrated to the United States. America promised something many immigrants dreamed of, a chance to start over. After arriving, she settled in Chicago, a city that was growing rapidly and attracting newcomers from across Europe. It was there that Brynhild gradually became known by a different name, Belle. The transformation was not unusual. Many immigrants adopted simpler names that were easier for English speakers to pronounce. But in Belle's case, the new name would eventually become known far beyond the immigrant communities of the Midwest. At first, however, there was nothing especially remarkable about her life. She worked. She built connections within the Norwegian immigrant community. And like countless others who had crossed the Atlantic in search of opportunity, she began trying to establish a future in her new country. To the people around her, Belle appeared determined, practical, and hardworking. No one could have imagined that decades later, her name would become associated with one of the darkest mysteries in American history. Yet if later investigators were correct, the first signs of that mystery may have already been beginning to take shape. Because wherever Belle seemed to go, death often appeared to follow. In 1884, Belle married a fellow Norwegian immigrant named Mads Albert Sorensen. To friends and neighbors, the marriage appeared ordinary. The couple settled into life together and worked toward the same goal shared by many immigrant families: stability, financial security, and a better future. Over the following years, they built a life in the Chicago area and later became involved in several business ventures. At first, there was little reason for anyone to pay special attention to them. But years later, when investigators began examining Belle's past, a troubling pattern started to emerge. One of the couple's properties was destroyed by fire. The loss was unfortunate, but it was also insured. The insurance payment helped offset the damage. Then, another property suffered a similar fate. Again, insurance money followed. By itself, that might not have seemed unusual. Fires were common in an era when homes were heated with stoves, lit by lamps, and often built largely from wood. Still, some observers would later look back and wonder whether these incidents were simply bad luck or something else. The questions became even more serious in July 1900. That was when Mads Sorensen died unexpectedly. Officially, his death was attributed to heart failure, but almost immediately, rumors began to circulate. According to reports from the time, Mads died on a day when two separate life insurance policies overlapped. One policy was ending, another had just begun. The timing attracted attention. To some people, it seemed like an extraordinary coincidence. To others, it seemed impossible to ignore. Local authorities looked into the circumstances surrounding his death. There were suggestions that poison might have been involved, but proving such a claim was far more difficult in the early 20th century than it would be today. No charges were filed, no murder case was opened, and Belle received the insurance payout. Legally, the matter was closed, yet the rumors never disappeared. As investigators would later discover, Mads was not the only member of Belle's household whose death raised questions. Records indicate that some of the couple's children died while still young. Child mortality was unfortunately common during that period, and many families experienced similar tragedies. Even so, later writers examining Belle's life pointed to these deaths as part of a larger pattern. Some believed the losses were natural and unrelated. Others suspected there was more to the story. More than a century later, definitive answers remain impossible to establish. What is certain is that by the time Mads Sorensen died, Belle had once again found herself receiving money after a tragedy. And she was no longer a struggling immigrant trying to build a future. She was a widow with resources. A widow who would soon make a decision that changed the course of her life. After Mads's death, Belle left the Chicago area and moved to rural Indiana. There, near the town of Porte, she purchased a farm. To many people, it looked like a fresh start, a chance to leave old hardships behind, a chance to build something new. But in the years ahead, the farm would become the center of a mystery that still fascinates historians today. Because the deaths connected to Belle Gunness were not over. In fact, they may have only been beginning. What happened next would make Belle Gunness infamous. At the start of the 20th century, LaPorte County was a quiet agricultural region in northern Indiana. The area was known for its farmland, scattered homes, and small communities where neighbors often knew one another by name. It was here that Belle Gunness decided to begin a new chapter of her life. Using money from insurance settlements and savings accumulated over the years, she purchased a farm on the outskirts of LaPorte. The property offered exactly what many people were seeking at the time: land, opportunity, and independence. To outsiders, Belle appeared to be succeeding. She was a widow who owned her own farm and seemed determined to make it prosper. Neighbors often described her as physically strong, hardworking, and capable of handling difficult labor. She was not the image many people associated with vulnerability. If anything, Belle projected confidence, and before long, she found another husband. His name was Peter Gunness. Peter was also an immigrant and, like Belle, was trying to build a stable life in America. The marriage seemed practical and promising, but it would not last long. In December 1902, tragedy struck again. Peter Gunness died in what was officially ruled an accident. According to reports, a heavy meat grinder had fallen from a shelf and struck him on the head. The injury proved fatal. Even at the time, some people found the explanation difficult to accept. The accident sounded unusual, and when viewed alongside the death of Belle's first husband, it raised uncomfortable questions. Authorities examined the case. There were suspicions, there were rumors. But once again, no criminal charges were filed. Officially, Peter's death remained exactly what it had been declared to be, an accident. Belle inherited the property and continued operating the farm. And once again, insurance money entered the picture. For many people, the pattern was becoming harder to ignore. A husband dies, money follows, questions are raised, nothing is proven, life moves on. Yet, despite the whispers circulating around town, Belle remained a respected member of the community. She worked the farm, raised her children, attended church, and outwardly appeared to be a woman overcoming hardship through determination and hard work. Few people realized that the farm was about to become something much more than a place to live, because Belle had discovered a new way to bring people into her life, a method that would connect her to men from across the Midwest, men searching for companionship, men searching for marriage, and men who often arrived carrying everything they owned. The advertisements would seem simple enough, just a few lines printed in a newspaper. But for some of the men who answered them, those advertisements would become the last known step in their lives. By the early 1900s, Belle Gunness was a widow, living alone on a large farm outside Porte. Running a farm required labor, money, and stability. And according to the image she presented to the world, she was looking for a partner to help her build a future. At least, that was what her advertisement suggested. Across the United States, newspapers regularly published personal notices from people seeking companionship, marriage, or business opportunities. For many rural residents, these advertisements were one of the few ways to meet someone outside their immediate community. Most attracted little attention. Belle's, however, would later become infamous. The notices described a successful widow with valuable property who was looking for a reliable husband. The message was carefully crafted. She appeared respectable, financially secure, and ready to share her life with the right person. For lonely men hoping to start over, the offer seemed genuine. Some began writing letters, others traveled to Indiana to meet her in person. The correspondence often followed a similar pattern. Belle would encourage the men to visit the farm. She would speak about marriage, about building a life together, about opportunity. And according to later testimony, she sometimes advised them to arrive with cash rather than leaving their money in banks or other institutions. Whether this was presented as a practical suggestion or something more deliberate remains unclear. But the result was the same. Several men arrived carrying substantial savings. Many of those men would never return home. At first, their disappearances did not immediately attract widespread attention. America was a large country. People moved frequently. Communication was slower than it is today. When someone vanished, families often spent weeks or months trying to locate them before involving authorities. This delay created opportunities for questions to go unanswered, and in Belle's case, it may have helped protect whatever was happening on the farm. When relatives asked about missing men, they often received explanations. A relationship had ended. Plans had changed. the man had decided to go elsewhere. Sometimes letters appeared that seemed to support those claims, but not everyone accepted the explanations. Some families remained unconvinced. They knew the men who had traveled to Indiana. They knew the plans they had made, and they knew how unusual it was for them to disappear without warning. As years passed, more names became connected to Belle Gunness, more visitors, more unanswered questions, more families searching for relatives who never came home. Yet, despite the growing concerns, there was still no clear evidence linking Belle to a crime. Only rumors, only suspicions, and a list of missing men that continued to grow. From the outside, the farm remained what it had always appeared to be, a successful property owned by a hard-working widow. But beneath that ordinary image, something far darker may have been developing. Because among the men who answered Belle's advertisements was one whose disappearance would eventually draw far more attention than the others. His name was Andrew Helgelien, and his family refused to stop asking questions. She believed fate wanted to take her son, and she became convinced someone else had to be sacrificed instead. Andrew Helgelien was a Norwegian immigrant living in South Dakota. Like many people who had come to America seeking opportunity, he worked hard and managed to build financial security over the years. When he learned about Belle Gunness, he appeared interested in the future she described. The two exchanged letters, plans were discussed, and eventually, Andrew decided to travel to Indiana. Before leaving, he informed people close to him about his intentions. This was not a secret trip. Friends and relatives knew where he was going. They knew who he intended to meet, and they expected to hear from him again. In January 1908, Andrew arrived at Belle's farm. After that, he effectively vanished. When family members attempted to contact him, they received no satisfactory explanation. His disappearance was alarming, but what made it even more concerning was that Andrew was not the first man connected to Belle who seemed to have disappeared without a trace. Investigators would later examine other cases involving men who had traveled to Porte after corresponding with Belle. Among the names frequently mentioned were Ole Budsberg and Olaf Lindblom. Like Andrew, they had reportedly been attracted by the promise of marriage and a new beginning. Like Andrew, they were connected to Belle's farm. And like Andrew, they seemingly disappeared. The exact number of missing men remains a subject of debate even today. Some historians believe the list was relatively small. Others argue that many disappearances were never properly documented. The truth may never be known. What is clear is that concern was growing. Families began comparing stories. Patterns started to emerge. The same destination, the same promises, the same silence afterward. And for the first time, someone decided not to accept that silence. Andrew Helgelien's brother, Azel Helgelien, became determined to discover what had happened. Unlike others who eventually gave up, Azel continued searching. He contacted authorities, he traveled, he asked difficult questions, and most importantly, he focused his attention directly on Belle Gunness. The pressure was beginning to build. For years, rumors had surrounded the farm. Now those rumors were turning into active suspicion. People wanted answers, and they were getting closer than ever before. Yet no one could have imagined how quickly events were about to change. Because while Andrew's family searched for the truth, a disaster was already approaching the Gunness farm. A disaster that would shock the nation. A disaster that would transform a missing persons mystery into something far more horrifying. And when the smoke finally cleared, investigators would make a discovery beneath the ruins that changed everything. For years, Belle Gunness had appeared to be a woman rebuilding her life after tragedy. But behind that image, questions had been growing. Too many deaths, too many disappearances. In April 1908, fire erupted on the Gunness farm. When the flames were finally extinguished, the house was gone. And beneath the ashes, investigators would uncover a scene that stunned even experienced authorities. Because the mystery of Belle Gunness was about to become far darker than anyone had imagined. And the biggest question was still ahead. Did Belle Gunness die in that fire? Or was it the perfect opportunity to disappear? Next on True Echoes. The questions surrounding Belle Gunness had been growing for years. Missing men, unanswered letters, families searching for loved ones who never returned home. But before those questions could be answered, everything changed. In April 1908, fire consumed the Gunness farmhouse. When investigators arrived, they expected to find the remains of a tragic accident. Instead, they discovered something far more disturbing. A body without a head, freshly disturbed ground, and evidence suggesting that the missing men may never have left the farm at all. As the investigation expanded, more human remains were uncovered. The number of possible victims continued to grow. And one question began to overshadow all the others. Because this time, the mystery was not only who had died, but whether Belle Gunness was among them, or if the woman known as the Black Widow of Porte had escaped before the fire ever began. Next on True Echoes, Belle Gunness, The Farm of Bones, Part 2. The truth coming soon on True Echoes. Stories don't end, they echo. What do you think so far? Was Belle Gunness simply surrounded by extraordinary bad luck? Or do you believe the pattern already points to something much darker? Let us know in the comments below. Every voice matters. Subscribe and step into the echoes of truth. To be continued.